Okay, this is episode 2 of the review of the summer reading book 1776 by David McCullough. Hopefully, this is helpful to you. Chapter 2, which we'll just jump right into, was entitled Rabble in Arms. It could kind of be subtitled A Soldier's Life. It's divided into 3 parts, so I'll kind of tell you when I shift from part 1 to part 2. The first part of chapter 2 begins by giving a kind of a picture or a portrait, a synopsis of what a very important commander in this war by the name of Nathaniel Greene, what he was like. He's going to become kind of Washington's right-hand man, so to speak, in the Revolutionary War. So you need to know a little bit about him. In the time that the book is set, he was 33 years old. He was a Quaker, which is kind of interesting because Quakers are pacifists. They generally don't fight, aren't engaged in the military, but he does. He becomes known as the Fighting Quaker. He was from Rhode Island. He had not received any formal education as a military commander, self-educated, read every book he could on military strategy and command, and again will become quite an excellent commander during the Revolutionary War. Washington trusted him a lot. The book then goes in the first part of chapter 2 there and just describes the scene at Boston. The first part of the book, like I mentioned to you, is set in Boston. And troops from New England are arriving in Boston. Washington is taking command. You can look at the PowerPoint that I posted on RenWeb, and I posted some maps there as a part of that PowerPoint, which I think would be a good idea for you to look at. But in the battle, the fighting that took place in Boston, the British controlled the center of town, sometimes referred to as Charleston, and the Patriots controlled the surrounding area, looking in on the center part of Boston. So the book talks about that a little bit. Washington was aided in reconnaissance outside of Boston by a map maker by the name of John Trumbull. He would have been maybe 18, 19 years old at the time. McCullough doesn't go into it, but Trumbull's going to become a very famous portrait painter after the American Revolution, of scenes of the American Revolution. I think it's the $1 bill. I can't remember. You can check. But the back of the bill that has a picture of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, that's John Trumbull. There's famous portraits of George Washington himself. So Washington is helped by these maps that are drawn here. Talks about the life of the common soldier, and McCullough is pretty critical of the American troops that gathered in Boston. They didn't set up very nice or neat camps other than Nathaniel Greene's Rhode Islanders, and disease was pretty rampant among American soldiers because they simply didn't take care of themselves. They didn't clean themselves. They didn't clean their clothes. So disease spread quite a good bit. Washington, as the men they dig trenches at Boston. Washington is trying to instill in that army discipline, and it's going to take some time to do that. A character by the name of Israel Putnam, the soldiers referred to him as Old Put, was a favorite among the soldiers. He had been a hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill, so was kind of a crowd favorite there. It mentions that fighting between the British and the American soldiers wasn't very intensified at this point. You have some sharpshooters firing at each other, things of that nature. McCullough mentions that African Americans, Negroes, fought on both sides in this war. Mentions that they're gathering in Boston, so you have African Americans that are fighting both for the Patriots, and some do join the British with the promise of freedom. Those that were slaves, promise of freedom if the British won. You have Washington dealing with significant problems with this army. Their enlistments were only a year. Morale was fairly low. Pay was sporadic and not very good. So desertion was pretty high, and that became quite troubling and is going to be a problem for Washington, and often had to argue to Congress, please make these enlistments longer, pay these men, give them promises of some pensions after the war to try to keep attrition at a minimum. That's what part 1 of chapter 2 dealt with. Part 2 of chapter 2, begins with a picture and a description of George Washington himself. And it told you a little bit about his setting or setup there at Boston. He was a very dignified man, always dressed very, very well. His uniform would always be, spit and polished. He wanted to look the part of the general, of a commander. He believed that was important. He stayed in the abandoned house in Boston of a loyalist, those who were loyal to England during the war. Stayed in an abandoned loyalist house, 3-story house, servants, etc. It mentions throughout the book, but he's introduced here in chapter 2, part 2, that Washington was almost always with a trusted servant, a black man, really a slave, by the name of William or Billy Lee, who, second only to George Washington, was considered by many to be the best horseback rider around during the war. That second part of chapter 2 gives you a description of George Washington. He had probably had 7 or 8 years of schooling growing up. Very dignified man, wrote a little pamphlet or a book called 110 Rules of Civility, the way that a gentleman was supposed to behave in public. Became a surveyor, mapped out land as you have a move west into Virginia and the Ohio River Valley. He did that. That's what brought Washington into his service for Britain in the French and Indian War. He was quite active in that war, fired upon a number of times, but had a very spotted, at best, military career during the French and Indian War. After his service in the French and Indian War, he married a very wealthy widow by the name of Martha Dandridge Custis. She was apparently a pretty woman, but there's no doubt that Washington was drawn to her, at least in part by the fact that she was very wealthy. So he lived in a large house prior to his service in the American Revolution, had slaves and servants, kind of lived the life of a gentleman, kind of not unlike the English gentry at the time, somewhat of an aristocrat. Excellent horseback rider, fox hunter, etc. McCullough kind of deals with the question, when Washington became commander of the American Army, was he fit for the job? Did he want the job? Well, a lot of people have speculated. That's a great question to ask. But be aware of that tension with Washington. We think of Washington today, the hero, father of the country, but he was an untested commander and is going to be under fire for some of the things that happened in the course of this book. And endurance was one of his major and most admiring qualities there. He knew, that is, Washington knew, that getting the support of Congress, their money and support, was key, so he's going to have to write them letters, always arguing for more money. So that's what the second part of chapter 2 did, dealt with the portrait of Washington a little bit. The third part of chapter 2 kind of begins to unpack the fighting that's going to take place in Boston that will ultimately culminate in the British evacuating Boston. I said fighting in Boston. Actually, there's not just a whole lot of that. So the third part of chapter 2 mentions that in the midst of what's going on in Washington, that Washington will order and will allow an invasion of Canada. Three-pronged attack up into Canada that ends up being a total failure. You have Montgomery. I can't remember Montgomery's first name, but he's injured, perhaps even killed. A guy by the name of Benedict Arnold, who we consider a traitor but fought very nobly at this point in the war. He's also injured in this failed invasion of Canada. So that's going on simultaneous with what's happening in Boston here. Charles Lee, another important character that will run through the first, almost the entirety of this book, was second in command to George Washington and kind of rivaled him and perhaps wanted to become the overall commander. So be aware of him. He was very opinionated, kind of moody, McCullough described him kind of almost like boiling water, almost ready to erupt at any point. Washington would often hold councils of war where he would invite his major subordinates there, and they would decide what they needed to do. Should they seek to attack the British in Boston? Well, they're ultimately going to decide not to do that. So you see some of the discussion about these councils of war. Part 3 of Chapter 2 deals with a traitor by the name of Dr. Benjamin Church, who Washington admired a lot, but began to become a traitor for the British. He was uncovered, and Washington, of course, was devastated. The British, some of their actions are beginning to seem very foul and offensive to the Americans. There's the burning of a settlement at Falmouth, which really upsets Washington and some others. So you see that being developed. Another very important character that's introduced in Part 3 of Chapter 2 here is a guy by the name of Henry Knox. So you have Nathaniel Greene, Henry Knox are kind of the two most significant sub-commanders of George Washington. Knox was also self-educated. He had been a bookstore owner prior to his service in the military. He had lost a couple of fingers in a hunting accident, and he was married to a lady whose family were Tories. The name of that family, I think it was Fluker. It may be skipping my mind there, but he married a Fluker, and their family were loyalists, and that's going to cause a little bit of tension for him. But he is going to become a very skilled artillery commander, and Washington liked Knox a lot. His kind of try anything, let's see what happens approach, and Washington trusted him quite a bit. Mentions kind of a strange little incident that happened at Boston. Again, the soldiers that are gathering in Boston, the American soldiers, aren't very well trained. They had never served in the military before, very independent spirited folks, and it mentions that Washington, very likely, there's some speculation, did it happen, didn't it happen? Pretty likely, probably did happen, that Washington actually had to personally break up a snowball fight among his own army that had gotten out of hand. Looked at this as folks were going to be killed there. So as you get to the end of Chapter 2, you have a situation where Washington, who was usually fairly upbeat and very positive, is kind of depressed here. A little bit of doubt is beginning to seep in. Now, he would never make the mistake of telling his men or his subordinates that he had doubts. It mentions that his wife Martha made a very difficult trip to Boston to visit him. And toward the end of Chapter 2, Congress had finally made the decision that they wanted Washington's army to attack Boston and to attempt to drive the British out. So Washington, as we move into Chapter 3, is going to have to decide if and how he's going to do that. So you end Chapter 2 with morale being fairly low, but yet Washington determined to do what Congress had ordered him to do, which was to drive the British out of Boston. So that's a decent summary, I hope, of Chapter 2. I hope that helps you out. Next episode, we'll deal with Chapter 3.